When we fasten our seatbelts, we put our lives in the hands of the captain. What happens if the door between the pilots and the passengers locks from the inside?
Think rate, pull up, terrain, pull up, pull up.
In some cases, the most dangerous force on board may not be a fierce storm or a malfunctioning engine. It may be the pilot. 2 recorders were on board SilkAir Flight 185. Both stopped working before the airplane hit the ground. Not at the same time. Not because of impact. The cockpit voice recorder went silent first. 6 minutes later, the flight data recorder followed. In a modern Boeing 737, those 2 systems run on separate circuits. For both to stop in sequence while the aircraft was still cruising at 35,000 feet, someone had to physically pull 2 circuit breakers by hand. SilkAir was a regional subsidiary of Singapore Airlines. Flight 185 was an 80-minute hop from Jakarta, Indonesia to Singapore on December 19, 1997. The aircraft was a 737-300, 10 months old, one of the newest in the fleet. 104 people were on board. In the left seat was Captain Su Wei Ming, a 41-year-old former military pilot. In the right seat was First Officer Duncan Ward, a New Zealander. 45 minutes in, with the 737 cruising over Sumatra, the cockpit voice recorder captured Captain Su saying he was leaving the cockpit to get water. A seatbelt unbuckled. A seat slid back. 13 seconds later, the recorder went dead. Engineers later tested an identical aircraft and found that when the circuit breaker trips from an electrical fault, it produces an audible click on the recording. When pulled out by hand, no click. On the recording from Flight 185, there was no click. 6 minutes passed. The flight data recorder kept running during this gap, showing the aircraft holding steady, autopilot engaged. Then it too went dead. Jakarta radar told the rest. At 4:12 in the afternoon, the 737 was at cruise altitude. 8 seconds later, it had dropped 400 feet. Then it disappeared from radar entirely, plunging in a near-vertical dive that broke the speed of sound. The tail structure came apart from the forces before the aircraft reached the Musi River near the city of Palembang in southern Sumatra. The 737 hit the water so hard, the fuselage disintegrated into fragments. Investigators ran 20 different failure simulations. None matched the radar profile. The only scenario that replicated the actual descent was a sustained, deliberate nose-down input at the controls. The American National Transportation Safety Board concluded it was a deliberate act, most likely by the captain. No mechanical failure caused or contributed to the crash. The recorders were intentionally disconnected. Recovery was possible but never attempted by whoever was flying. Indonesia's safety committee reached no conclusion at all. Their chairman overruled members of his own team who agreed with the Americans. A later press report cited a secret internal document confirming Indonesian authorities would not issue a verdict because they feared it would make people too frightened to fly. A profile of Captain Su had been building in the background. He had accumulated heavy financial losses through stock trading. His securities account had been suspended 10 days before the flight. He had faced disciplinary action at the airline, and on a previous flight, he had pulled the cockpit voice recorder circuit breaker for no documented reason. He already knew how to silence the box. The family sued in Singapore and the United States. A Singapore court ruled the evidence of a deliberate act had not been proven. A separate civil trial in Los Angeles, barred from hearing the American Safety Board's findings, concluded a defective rudder component caused the crash. Boeing eventually dropped its claim against the captain and settled out of court. So the official record remains split. One investigation says it was deliberate. Another says the cause is unknown. A civil court says it was mechanical. And the 2 devices designed to answer exactly this kind of question were both silenced before the airplane began its final dive. Whatever happened in that cockpit during the 6-minute gap between the recorders going dark is something only one person could have explained. He did not survive to do so.
Think rate, pull up, terrain, pull up, pull up.
The banging on the cockpit door lasted almost 4 minutes. The cockpit voice recorder captured every second of it, fists hitting reinforced metal over and over, growing more desperate as the Embraer jet descended through altitude it was never supposed to leave. Alarms were sounding inside the cockpit.
Pull up.
The ground proximity warning system was calling out, and behind the locked door, the captain sat alone, making no attempt to stop what he had started. Mozambique Airlines Flight 470 was a scheduled service from Mozambique to Angola on November 29, 2013. The aircraft was a brand new Embraer 190, barely a year old. inspected the day before with no faults. 33 people were on board. In the left seat was Captain Herminio dos Santos Fernandez, with over 9,000 hours. In the right seat was First Officer Gracio Chimuquile, 24 years old, still early in his career. An hour and 50 minutes into the flight, cruising at 38,000 feet over Botswanan airspace, the first officer said he needed to use the lavatory. The captain said no problem. The first officer left and the door locked behind him. Under LAM's own rules, a cabin crew member was supposed to take his place, so no one would be alone at the controls. That did not happen. What the flight data recorder captured next was methodical. Within seconds, the autopilot's target altitude was changed 3 times, from 38,000 feet to 4,288, then to 1,888, then to 592, a setting below ground level in the terrain they were flying over. The autothrottle was switched off. Speed brakes were deployed. Every input pointed in one direction, down. The first officer returned from the lavatory and found the cockpit door locked. He began pounding on it. The recorder picked up continuous banging, shouting, demands to be let in. The captain did not respond. He did not open the door. He did not touch the radio. At any point during the descent, recovery was possible. The Embraer was mechanically sound. The engines were running. All that was needed was for someone to pull back and add power. Nobody did. The aircraft struck the ground in the Bwabwata National Park, a remote stretch of northern Namibia. The wreckage slid several hundred meters across the savannah. All 33 people on board were lost. Both recorders were sent to the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington. Investigators ran multiple simulations. Every scenario confirmed the same thing. The only way to reproduce the data was sustained, deliberate input from the left seat. No mechanical failure matched. One investigator later noted that the inputs showed the captain had thorough knowledge of the aircraft's systems, using them to produce a smooth, consistent descent from cruise all the way into the ground. When investigators looked into Captain Fernandez's life, they found a man carrying more than anyone at the airline had assessed. He had separated from his wife a decade earlier, proceedings still unresolved. His son had died in a suspected self-inflicted act the previous November. Fernandez did not attend the funeral. The anniversary of his son's passing fell almost exactly on the date of the crash. None of this had been flagged in any evaluation. 16 months later, a Germanwings first officer would lock a captain out of the cockpit and fly an Airbus into the French Alps using the same method. After that crash, investigators looked back at Mozambique Flight 470 and asked why nothing had changed. The answer was painful. The Mozambique crash had received almost no international coverage. It happened on a small regional airline in a developing country with a modest passenger count. The lessons were there, the pattern was already visible, but the world was not watching. On the outbound flight from Dusseldorf to Barcelona, while Captain Patrick Sondenheimer briefly stepped out of the cockpit, 27-year-old First Officer Andreas Lubitz reached for the altitude selector on the Airbus A320's autopilot and dialed it down to 100 feet. Then he set it back. Then he did it again. Each time, resetting before the system responded, testing how quickly the numbers changed, how long he had before anyone would notice. The flight data recorder captured every input. Nobody knew. 3 hours later, the same aircraft pushed back from Barcelona with 144 passengers and 6 crew for the return to Dusseldorf. In the left seat was Sondenheimer, 34, with about 6,000 hours. In the right seat was Lubitz, with 630. At cruising altitude, the captain mentioned he had not used the lavatory before departure. Lubitz told him he could go any time. There was the sound of a seat sliding back. The captain said you can take over and left the cockpit. The door clicked shut. Within seconds, the altitude selector moved from 38,000 feet to 100. The autopilot began a steady descent. Lubitz did not touch the radio. He did not respond when Marseille Control called repeatedly. He did not answer the cockpit intercom. The recorder captured only his breathing, steady and even through the entire descent. Sondenheimer realized almost immediately. He pressed the door buzzer. No response. He entered the emergency override code on the keypad, a system that normally unlocks the door after 30 seconds. But the Airbus has a final failsafe. If someone inside moves the lock switch during those 30 seconds, the timer resets and the door stays sealed. Lubitz activated that override. The door, reinforced after September 11th to keep threats out of the cockpit, was now keeping the captain out. The recorder captured Sondenheimer pounding on the door, the sound of something heavy being swung against the frame. For 13 minutes, while the Airbus descended toward the French Alps, the captain tried everything to break through. The door held. It had been designed to withstand forced entry. It did exactly what it was built to do. In the final minute, the ground proximity warning activated. Passengers began screaming. Lubitz did not respond to the alarm. He did not touch the controls. At 10:41, the Airbus struck a mountainside near the town of Prad at over 400 miles per hour. All 150 people on board were lost. The largest piece of wreckage found was smaller than a car door. The investigation uncovered a man who had been falling apart while the system designed to catch him failed at every level. Lubitz had entered Lufthansa's training program in 2008. During training, he was treated for severe depression with psychotic features and temporarily denied an American pilot's license. Lufthansa knew about the interruption. He was eventually cleared and received his commercial license in 2012. In the months before the crash, he had visited more than 40 doctors, convinced he was going blind. The fear consumed him. He believed losing his eyesight would end his career, and losing his career would end everything. In the week before March 24th, he searched online for methods of ending his life and for how cockpit door locks work. A doctor had written him a note declaring him unfit for duty on the day of the crash. Lubitz tore it up. Under German medical privacy law, the doctor could not contact the airline. The system relied entirely on the pilot reporting his own condition. Lubitz chose not to. That is the irony at the center of this disaster. After September 11th, the industry spent billions reinforcing cockpit doors so no one from outside could ever seize control of an aircraft. The door on Germanwings Flight 9525 worked exactly as intended. It kept an unauthorized person out. The problem was that the threat was not outside. It was inside. A system built to protect the cockpit became the instrument that sealed 150 people's fate. European regulators responded by requiring 2 authorized people in the cockpit at all times. But by 2017, several airlines had quietly dropped the rule. The deeper problem, how to identify a pilot who is hiding a condition that makes him dangerous, remains largely unsolved. Medical certification still depends on self-reporting. Pilots who seek help still risk their licenses. The culture that made Lubitz afraid to tell anyone the truth has not fundamentally changed. 16 students from Haltern am See never came home from their trip to Spain. Their empty desks stayed in the classroom for weeks. The school planted 16 trees. In the Alps, recovery teams worked for months on a mountainside so thoroughly destroyed that nearly every identification required DNA. A reinforced door, built to stop the worst thing the industry could imagine, had instead enabled it. That is Germanwings. That is Flight 9525. Good night. Malaysian 370. Those were the last words anyone heard from the cockpit of Malaysia Airlines, spoken by Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah at 12:42 in the morning on March 8, 2014, acknowledging a routine handoff to Ho Chi Minh Control. The first officer did not speak. The crew never checked in with Vietnamese controllers. And from that moment, a Boeing 777 carrying 239 people became the most searched-for object in human history. 5 seconds after the aircraft crossed into Vietnamese airspace, the transponder vanished from radar. Someone in the cockpit had switched off the systems that told the world where the airplane was. But the 777 did not fall. Malaysian military radar picked up an unidentified contact turning sharply left, back across the Malay Peninsula, then northwest up the Strait of Malacca. Whoever was flying was deliberately threading between the coverage zones of neighboring countries. The aircraft flew for almost an hour along this route, before disappearing near the island of Penang, the captain's hometown. After that, the only trace came from an unexpected source. A satellite communication system on the aircraft, which had not been switched off, continued exchanging automated signals with an Inmarsat satellite over the Indian Ocean. Engineers realized they could use the timing of those signals to estimate the aircraft's distance from the satellite at each ping. The final signal, nearly 7 hours after the last radio call, placed the airplane somewhere along a vast arc stretching across the deep southern Indian Ocean. Combined with fuel calculations and the military radar track, investigators concluded the aircraft had turned south and flown for hours into one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth. The search became the most expensive in aviation history. Over 120,000 square kilometers of seabed were scanned. Nothing was found. Then in 2015, a piece of the wing washed ashore on Réunion Island, thousands of kilometers from the search zone. Over the following months, more than 20 fragments were recovered from beaches across the western Indian Ocean. The physical evidence confirmed the airplane had ended violently in the water, but the fuselage, the recorders, and the answers remained somewhere on the ocean floor. Malaysia's official report stated the cause could not be determined, but police identified the captain as the primary suspect if human intervention was involved, and what accumulated around Captain Zahari was difficult to dismiss. At his home, Zahari had built an elaborate flight simulator. After the disappearance, police seized it and sent the data to the FBI. Buried in the system files, never meant to be found, was a saved session that closely resembled the actual path of 370. The route ran up the Strait of Malacca, turned south past Sumatra, and continued into the southern Indian Ocean, terminating near the zone where investigators believed the aircraft went down. The session was not a continuous flight. It was a series of brief waypoints, as if someone had programmed the route and skipped along it to check specific segments. Friends described Zahari as lonely and withdrawn in the months before the flight. His wife and children had reportedly moved out the day before. He was deeply upset about his marriage and about the imprisonment of an opposition politician he supported. Whether any of this constituted a motive, no investigation has established. His family called the accusations baseless. His sister pointed out 30 years of service, 18,000 hours, and no record of misconduct. The Malaysian lead investigator publicly dismissed the theory. The FBI found nothing suspicious on the simulator beyond the single Indian Ocean route. No one has proven what happened. No confession, no note, no wreckage that reveals whether the airplane was under control when it hit the water. What is known is that someone with deep knowledge of the 777's systems disabled its tracking, avoided detection by multiple countries, and pointed it toward a part of the ocean where it might never be found. Most experts who have studied the evidence agree. It would be harder to explain all of this as coincidence than as a plan. More than 11 years later, 239 families are still waiting for the ocean to give back what it took. It has not. Pull with me. That is what Captain El Habashi kept repeating as he fought the controls of a Boeing 767 that was diving toward the Atlantic Ocean at nearly the speed of sound. Pull with me. He had rushed back into the cockpit after feeling the aircraft pitch forward, grabbed his control column and hauled it back as hard as he could. The flight data recorder showed his side of the elevator responding, commanding nose up, but the other side, the right elevator, was simultaneously commanding nose down. Two columns in the same cockpit, connected to the same airplane, pulling in opposite directions. The 767 tore itself apart between the two inputs. At 1:50 in the morning on October 31st, 1999, 60 miles south of Nantucket Island, all 217 people on board EgyptAir Flight 990 hit the water. The flight had left John F. Kennedy Airport in New York just 30 minutes earlier, the second leg of a Los Angeles to Cairo route. The Boeing 767 was in good mechanical condition. 203 passengers were on board, along with 14 crew, including 2 complete flight crews, because the transatlantic crossing required a handoff midway through. The active crew would fly the first few hours, then the relief crew would take over for the middle portion. What made the cockpit arrangement unusual that night was timing. First Officer Gamil Al-Batouti was not scheduled to take the controls until hours into the flight. Instead, about 20 minutes after takeoff, he entered the cockpit and suggested that the active first officer let him take over early. The young first officer agreed and left the right seat. Al-Batouti took his place. Captain El Habashi remained in the left seat for a few more minutes, then stepped out, likely to use the lavatory. For a brief window, Al-Batouti was alone at the controls. The cockpit voice recorder captured what happened next. In the empty cockpit, Al-Batouti began repeating a phrase in Arabic. "I rely on God." He said it quietly, almost under his breath, multiple times. Then, the autopilot disconnected. The throttles moved to idle. The 767's nose dropped and the aircraft began a steep dive, accelerating through 33,000 feet toward the ocean below. In the first 36 seconds, the airplane plunged almost 14,000 feet. Somewhere during that dive, the captain returned. The cockpit voice recorder captured him shouting, asking what was happening. He pulled back on his control column, commanding the elevators on his side to pitch the nose up. For a moment, the aircraft partially recovered. The descent slowed. The nose began to rise. But the flight data recorder showed something that made investigators stop cold. While the left elevator was responding to the captain's pull, the right elevator was still commanding nose down. Someone on the other side of the cockpit was pushing forward at the same time the captain was pulling back. The engines, which had been shut down during the dive, did not restart. The 767 entered a second dive. The captain's last recorded words were "pull with me," repeated over and over. Then the recorders went silent. The wreckage was scattered across the ocean floor in 250 feet of water. The United States Navy recovered the black boxes within days using a deep-sea submersible. When American and Egyptian investigators listened to the cockpit voice recording together at the National Transportation Safety Board's headquarters in Washington, the reaction in the room was immediate. An EgyptAir representative who heard the playback reportedly left ashen-faced and was not heard from again. The American investigation concluded that al-Batouti had deliberately put the aircraft into a dive while alone in the cockpit, and that when the captain returned and tried to recover, al-Batouti continued to push the nose down, creating the split elevator condition that made recovery impossible. The official probable cause named the relief first officer's flight control inputs as the reason for the crash. The reason behind those inputs was listed as not determined. Egypt rejected the finding completely. Egyptian authorities argued that the phrase tawakkalt ala Allah is a common expression used in daily life across the Arab world, not evidence of intent. They insisted the crash was caused by a mechanical failure in the elevator control system and accused the American investigation of cultural bias. The dispute became a diplomatic crisis. Omar Suleiman, the head of Egyptian intelligence, flew to Washington to intervene. Egypt published its own report concluding there was no deliberate act and pointing to potential mechanical causes that the American side had tested and ruled out. The two countries never agreed. The American Safety Board's final report, issued in March 2002, did not include a single safety recommendation, a rarity that reflected the board's view that no systemic fix could address what had happened. Egypt's report reached the opposite conclusion and maintained that its first officer had been wrongly accused. 25 years later, the case remains one of the most politically charged investigations in aviation history. 217 people left New York on a flight to Cairo. None of them arrived, and the only voice that could have explained why was recorded whispering the same 5 words into an empty cockpit 60 miles from shore, seconds before the dive began. Someone recorded it on a phone. That is how the world first saw China Eastern Flight 5735, not through radar data or an investigation report, but through a shaky cell phone video shot by a person on the ground in rural Guangxi province. The footage shows a Boeing 737 falling out of the sky at a nearly vertical angle, nose pointed straight down, accelerating toward the hills below. There is no spin, no tumble, no visible breakup. The aircraft drops like a dart, disappears behind a ridgeline, and a fireball rises above the trees. The video circulated across Chinese social media within hours. By nightfall, it had been seen around the world. Whatever had happened to Flight 5735, the footage made one thing immediately clear: this was not a normal descent. March 21st, 2022. The 737-800, one of the most widely flown commercial aircraft on the planet with a strong safety record spanning decades, had departed Kunming in southwestern China bound for Guangzhou, a flight of roughly 2 hours. 123 passengers and 9 crew were on board. The aircraft was 6 years old, recently maintained, with no reported mechanical issues before departure. It reached its cruising altitude of 29,100 feet and held steady. Air traffic controllers tracked it through Chinese airspace without incident. At 2:20 in the afternoon, the 737 was still cruising. Seconds later, it was not. The aircraft entered a sudden, steep descent, dropping at a rate so extreme that researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology later calculated it was approaching the speed of sound before impact. In less than 2 minutes, the 737 fell from cruise altitude to the ground. There was one brief anomaly during the plunge. At roughly 8,000 feet, the descent paused. The aircraft leveled slightly and even climbed for a few seconds before pitching over again and resuming its near-vertical dive. That momentary recovery would later become one of the most debated details of the investigation, because it suggested that at some point during the fall, someone may have tried to regain control, or that 2 people in the cockpit were fighting over the aircraft, one pushing down, the other pulling up. The 737 struck a mountainside in Teng County, Wuzhou, at such velocity that the impact created a crater and scattered debris across a wide area of forested hillside. There was no intact fuselage, no recognizable structure. Recovery teams found fragments of the aircraft mixed into the soil. The force was so severe that identification of the 132 people on board required weeks of DNA work. Every person was eventually confirmed gone. Both flight recorders were recovered from the crater. The cockpit voice recorder was found 2 days after the crash, severely damaged on the outside, but with its internal memory unit relatively intact. The flight data recorder was located several days later, buried deep in the mud. Both were sent to the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington for analysis, because Boeing, the manufacturer, is an American company. What the American investigators heard and read on those recorders changed the direction of the investigation. In May 2022, the Wall Street Journal reported that United States officials involved in the analysis had reached a preliminary conclusion. The aircraft had been deliberately put into its fatal dive by someone in the cockpit. The flight data recorder showed control inputs, made from inside the flight deck, commanding the airplane's nose down. No mechanical malfunction was found, no structural failure, no engine problem. The landing gear had not been deployed. The flaps had not been extended. There was no distress call, no mayday, no response to repeated attempts by air traffic control and nearby aircraft to make contact during the 2-minute descent. One American official, speaking to the Journal, summarized it in a single sentence: "The plane did what it was told to do by someone in the cockpit." ABC News published a concurrent report reaching the same conclusion. Both outlets noted that China Eastern Airlines had told investigators that no emergency cockpit access code had been broadcast, making it unlikely that an intruder had forced their way onto the flight deck. The evidence pointed toward someone who was already seated at the controls. The Chinese government's response was immediate and firm. The Civil Aviation Administration of China dismissed the American media reports as misleading, saying they seriously misled the public and interfered with the investigation. No official cause was announced. A preliminary report issued a month after the crash contained no determination of cause. A 1-year update in 2023 described the investigation as ongoing and called the circumstances very complicated and very rare. A 2-year update in 2024 disclosed nothing new. As of this recording, more than 3 years after the crash, no final report has been released. In 2025, Bloomberg reported that the Chinese government was withholding the investigation's findings on national security grounds. The silence has left a vacuum that the available evidence fills on its own. No technical fault has been identified with the aircraft, the engines, or the flight control systems. The 737-800 is one of the safest airframes in commercial aviation, with a record stretching back to the late 1990s. Chinese investigators have not pointed to any mechanical explanation. American investigators have pointed to deliberate input from the cockpit. And the video, the one piece of evidence the whole world has seen, shows an aircraft falling from the sky in a trajectory that no accidental failure has ever produced in the history of the 737 program. 32 seconds. That is how long Air India Flight 171 existed as a flying aircraft. From the moment its wheels left the runway at Ahmedabad to the moment it struck a medical student hostel less than 2 kilometers away, the entire flight lasted half a minute. A Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of the most advanced commercial aircraft ever built, loaded with fuel for a 10-hour journey to London, did not make it past the airport perimeter. 241 of the 242 people on board were lost, along with 19 people on the ground. One passenger, seated next to an emergency exit over the wing, crawled out of a gap in the broken fuselage and survived. His brother, seated nearby, did not. June 12, 2025. The Dreamliner pushed back from the gate at Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport in Ahmedabad, Western India, bound for London Gatwick. 230 passengers and 12 crew. In the left seat was Captain Sumit Sabharwal, 56, with roughly 15,600 hours and over 8,000 on the 787. In the right seat was First Officer Clive Kunder, 32, the pilot flying with about 3,400 hours. The aircraft was 11 years old, recently maintained, with no unresolved faults in its logbook. Kunder advanced the throttles. The Dreamliner rolled for 62 seconds, rotated at 155 knots, and lifted off. 3 seconds later, at 180 knots and barely a few hundred feet above the ground, both engine fuel control switches moved from run to cutoff, one after the other, 1 second apart. Those switches sit on the throttle control module between the two pilot seats, protected by mechanical guards specifically designed to prevent accidental activation. To move one, a pilot must pull it upward against a spring-loaded detent, then shift it sideways. To move both in sequence, within a second, requires deliberate physical action. both engines immediately lost thrust. The cockpit voice recorder captured what happened next. One pilot asked the other why he had cut off the fuel. The response, "I did not do so." Within seconds, the emergency ram air turbine deployed from the belly of the aircraft to provide backup electrical power. The fuel switches were pushed back to run. The 787 systems attempted to relight the engines. A partial restart may have occurred, but at that altitude, at that speed, with that much fuel on board and the ground rising ahead, there was almost nothing left to work with. One of the pilots transmitted a mayday reporting a loss of thrust. 32 seconds after liftoff, the Dreamliner's tail struck the roof of a hostel mess hall at BJ Medical College. The aircraft broke apart as it tore through the campus, and fuel ignited on impact. It was the first fatal crash of a Boeing 787 anywhere in the world, and almost immediately, the investigation split along lines that had become familiar from earlier cases in this video. India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau led the inquiry, with technical support from the American National Transportation Safety Board, Boeing, and Rolls-Royce. Both flight recorders were recovered and sent to Washington for analysis. The preliminary report, released a month after the crash, confirmed that the fuel switches had moved to cutoff and that both engines had shut down. It noted that a 2018 advisory from American regulators had warned of a potential flaw in the fuel switch locking mechanism on some Boeing aircraft, including the Dreamliner. Air India had not inspected the system. The advisory was not mandatory. But the preliminary report did not assign a cause, and from that point, the investigation became a battleground. In November 2025, the Wall Street Journal reported that American investigators believed the evidence pointed to Captain Sabharwal. As the monitoring pilot, he was seated closest to the fuel switches while the first officer focused on flying the aircraft through the critical seconds after liftoff. American officials noted that no attempt appeared to have been made from the left seat to pitch the nose up or recover the aircraft. The cockpit voice recording, once cleaned up at the National Transportation Safety Board's audio laboratory in Washington, reportedly allowed investigators to identify which pilot had moved the switches. In February 2026, the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, citing Western aviation sources, reported that the final investigation report was expected to conclude the fuel switches were moved intentionally, almost certainly by the captain. The same report cited unnamed sources saying Sabharwal had experienced depression in the weeks before the flight. India's response was sharp. The Civil Aviation Ministry rejected the foreign reports. The Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau stated that the inquiry was still open and that no conclusions had been reached. Captain Sabharwal's family publicly denied any history of mental health issues and called for an impartial investigation. Indian pilot associations accused investigators of attempting to protect the aircraft manufacturer and the airline by blaming the crew. American investigators, meanwhile, reportedly accused Indian authorities of restricting access to wreckage and withholding evidence. As of this recording, no final report has been issued. The official cause remains undetermined, but the pattern by now is unmistakable. A cockpit where one pilot was briefly free to act without oversight. A set of guarded controls that moved in a way no mechanical fault can explain. A voice recording in which one pilot denies doing what the data says someone did. And an investigation fracturing along national lines, with the country of the airline and the country of the manufacturer unable to agree on what happened in those 32 seconds between liftoff and impact. 7 flights, 3 decades, more than 1,000 lives. And in every single case, the person responsible for those lives was the same person who ended them. A first officer whispering a prayer into an empty cockpit over the Atlantic. A captain locking a door in Mozambique while his colleague pounds on the other side. A 27-year-old in the French Alps who rehearsed the descent on the morning flight and carried it out on the afternoon one. A 737 falling vertically out of the sky over southern China, with no explanation the government is willing to give. A Dreamliner that flew for 32 seconds before someone cut the fuel. These are not mechanical failures. They are not design flaws or weather events or maintenance shortcuts. They are the one category of aviation disaster that no engineering solution can fully prevent, because the threat is not in the wiring or the airframe. It is in the mind of the person the system has been built to trust. Aviation has spent a century learning how to keep airplanes from falling out of the sky. Stronger metals, smarter computers, redundant hydraulics, radar that can see wind shear, warnings that shout pull up when terrain is close. Almost every regulation in the book exists because something went wrong and someone figured out how to stop it from happening again. But when the danger sits in the left seat, with 18,000 hours in the logbook and full authority over every system on the aircraft, the usual defenses do not apply. The cockpit door that was reinforced to keep threats out can just as easily keep help from getting in. The autopilot that was designed to reduce workload can be reprogrammed in 2 seconds to aim at the ground. The medical system that is supposed to screen for fitness to fly depends on the pilot telling the truth. And the pilot who does not want to be grounded has every incentive not to. After Germanwings, European regulators required 2 people in the cockpit at all times. Some airlines dropped the rule within 2 years. After MH370, calls grew louder for cameras in the cockpit. Pilots' unions pushed back on privacy grounds. After Ahmedabad, the debate started again, and again it stalled. The industry knows the problem exists. It has known since at least 1994. But the solutions, better mental health screening, mandatory psychological evaluations, real-time cockpit monitoring, a culture where asking for help does not end a career, have moved slower than the threat. What connects every chapter in this video is not the method. It is the silence. In Morocco, the captain said nothing before he pushed the nose down. In Indonesia, both recorders were switched off before the dive began. Over the Atlantic, the first officer whispered 5 words into a cockpit he had emptied. In Mozambique, the only sounds were alarms and fists on a locked door. In the Alps, the captain screamed for 13 minutes while the first officer breathed calmly on the other side. In China, the government itself went silent. The people who could explain what happened chose not to, or were not alive to do so, or were prevented from speaking by forces larger than any single investigation. Flying remains the safest form of long-distance travel ever invented. That is not a cliché. It is a fact backed by decades of data. The chances of being on a flight where the person at the controls wants to reach the ground are astronomically small, but astronomically small is not zero. And until the industry finds a way to protect passengers from the one threat it cannot bolt a warning system onto, these stories will keep being told. If you want to stay with this channel and hear the ones that come next, subscribe and turn on notifications. We will be here,